Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our virtual Enlightenment Salon of February 5th, 2023. We have a fascinating conversation in store for you with regard to the possibilities that artificial intelligence has in store for us in terms of transforming our lives and enabling the transhuman transition, particularly in light of the phenomenal advances in generative AI technologies that have occurred over the past year. And of course, this will be a nuanced conversation, so we will explore some of the potential pitfalls and some of the concerns that some people may have regarding the uses of these technologies and the impacts that this transition will have on us as individuals and on our species. And today, to explore these kinds of questions, we have a distinguished panel joining us, including our legislative director, Jason Geringer, our director of visual art, Ramon Garcia, our director of scholarship, Dan Elton, our director of longevity outreach, Ben Ballweg, our director of community resilience, Alexandria Black, and our friend, the founder of London Futurists and Future Surge in the UK, David Wood. And our special guest is Daniel Faggella. He is the founder and head of research at Emerge Artificial Intelligence Research, that's spelled EMERJ. He is an internationally recognized speaker on the use cases and return on investment of artificial intelligence in business, and he has been quite a prolific speaker. He has actually delivered 4 TEDx talks up to this time. He is regularly called upon by global enterprises in financial services and security, and he has spoken for organizations including the World Bank, the United Nations, the OECD, INTERPOL, and many others. He has written various short and longer essays on technological transformation. 2 essays of his that I would like to point out today, and they are provided in the description of this video stream, are The Transhuman Transition, Lotus Eaters versus World Eaters, as well as You Don't Want What You Think You Want, AI and Procedurally Generated Worlds. So we're going to explore some of the themes covered in those essays during today's conversation. But now I would like to welcome Dan Faggella and give the floor to him for his opening remarks.
Great. Well, Gennady, I can't thank you enough for such a kind introduction here. I see a couple friendly faces that I know and plenty of new ones. I'm really looking forward to getting into the discussion today. As you've brought up, I'll just put as a caveat here, number one, I'm going to be pretty short with my ideas. I'd like to get into the discussion, but I do want to put the right ideas on the table. And so I've only got really 1.5 slides, you could say, to kick us off. Second, my background is not necessarily that of someone who's writing these AI systems or any kind of professional futurism background. I'm really just a market research person. So my job is to speak to the fellows who wrote DALL-E 2, for example, at OpenAI, or heads of AI at the Raytheons and the US banks of the world, and to get a sense of where those technologies are sort of taking us. So my standpoint, looking at the future, is really grounded in sort of where things are now, and where these technologies have sort of crawled forward over the last 4 or 5 years of us being a pretty ardent market research firm in this space. So I'll set the table with what I think are some of the bigger picture dynamics ahead based on some of our own sort of research and interview work with the people in this space. And then we'll just kind of rip it open into whatever questions people want to dive into, and I think it'll be fun. So I'll get into the first general idea here of sort of procedurally or programmatically generated everything. I think that the general idea that I'll argue for, and I'd love counter arguments if people have them, is this notion that we're sort of moving into a world of increasingly atomized, hyper-customized individual experiences. So first it'll be entertaining video or music scores that maybe we'll be able to AI generate, but it'll eventually turn into almost everything, any kind of entertainment, relaxation, adult content, work software will in some way be augmented and pretty immersive with regards to AI. And I would argue that most people, potentially it'll take 15 years, but most people will live primarily in hyper-personalized AR, VR sort of ecosystems and worlds, and not so much in sort of the physical world. The core idea here, which I'm sure we'll get into, and Gennady, you were kind enough to mention the longer essay on this topic on emerge.com, is you don't want what you think you want. The basic idea is people suppose that what they'd like, maybe when they're stressed out at work, is what they want to do is they want to walk in the woods and they want to ease their nerves, so to speak. But I think the argument that I'm sort of making in this presentation is that they simply want the fulfillment of that drive of relaxation, of that sort of urge towards relaxation. And if there is a procedurally generated experience, maybe that has nothing to do with the woods, maybe it's swirling purple colors with a dragon flying by in the background and strange noises unlike anything you've ever heard, whatever gets you to be relaxed is actually what you're looking for. People say that maybe they want a particular romantic partner. But again, the strong argument, detestable as it may be to some, is that essentially you want the fulfillment of those certain drives for connection, romance, physical intimacy, etc. And that when there are instantaneously hyper-customized, personalized permutations of any of those drives you might want to fulfill, to laugh, to experience excitement, to be relaxed, whatever the case may be, when AI can conjure those forth precisely for liking, most people will essentially leap directly into that, as opposed to sort of doing things the end way, and that there's almost no sort of fighting that tide. The enabling technologies here, which I'm sure we'll talk about, these three, there could be plenty more into the farther future. Inevitably, this leads to brain-computer interface and potentially much farther beyond that. But what we're going to talk about mostly is generative AI, virtual reality, potentially augmented reality, and biofeedback, only the third of which actually requires any explanation, so I'll be very brief. What I mean here is that right now, your recommendations, if you're on Netflix, let's just say, are based on what you click, what you pause, what you rewind, what you replay, your activities on the platform. Same thing with Amazon. What you add to cart, take from cart, purchase, don't purchase, see, click on, et cetera, search for. In the future, in terms of bringing people to the emotional states that they want, again, the argument here is everybody just wants a change in their qualia. They don't want what they say they want, not the red sports car, not the chocolate cake. Is eventually we will have some kind of potentially EEG or EKG, so looking at kind of brain signals, looking at heart rate, looking at maybe the sweatiness of our palms or the activities of our eyes, or eye tracking, and that these kinds of bits of biofeedback will really be what make these experiences compelling. Some of this will be developed for kind of adult content tech. Some of these will be developed for technology designed to help people relax. Already there's all kinds of help you meditate sort of apps, and in the future, those will increasingly involve some level of biofeedback. And biofeedback is going to be what allows these technologies to calibrate so snugly to your particular sense of what is humorous, what is relaxing, etc., at any given moment in time, that you would never go to the real world to satisfy those drives, because you'll be able to fulfill those circuits much better in the virtual world. So in terms of the motives to get us there, Gennady, you mentioned the idea of sort of lotus eaters and world eaters. I won't go too far, I guess, into those concepts, but the idea is that whether your aim is to be more powerful, to expand your potentia, or whether your aim is simply hedonic, to experience as much pleasure as possible, there essentially won't be a choice outside of really living pretty ardently in these VR worlds. The people that are most powerful will be the ones who step into them, to wield these technologies really fruitfully, to work in their business, to make sales, to answer customer service, to write code, whatever the case may be. They will be the most active, powerful wielders of these technologies by jumping into them fully. They will be doing what I refer to as competing in the state of nature with the new set of tools. So just same state of nature, new set of tools. Many people, however, will hop into this world with the intent of escaping the state of nature. We might argue that most people are aiming to escape the state of nature most of the time. We might argue that essentially all religions, Buddhism and then Christianity, you have the Veil of Tears, are essentially all about transitioning beyond eventually this sort of state of nature of toil and trouble that we find ourselves in. And many people will willfully leap into a world where they can complete those circuits of relaxation, excitement, sexual gratification, whatever the case may be, in the virtual space. And this whole transition in opens up a whole heap of potential concerns and considerations. I'll bring up just two what we might call dangers, or at least considerations moving forward, and we can kind of end on this. And anybody who wants to clarify will feel free, but I do want to try to be succinct with my part here. One of them is what I refer to as the substrate monopoly. So the idea is basically that in the back half of the 20th century, my argument is that essentially all great power conflict, whether it be economic or military or political, will be about controlling the substrate that houses the majority of human sentience and consequently the most powerful AI. And so if you own the substrate that's literally piping in the vast majority of qualia into people's heads, maybe not quite BCI yet, but VR, audio, etc. That's about as high on the dominance pyramid as you can get on this planet, and there will be a great deal of sort of wrestling to see who sort of gets to the top of that mountain. That's the supposition I'm putting on the table. A second one is that there will be a very intense set of motives driving people towards escapism, as opposed to contributing to what we might think of as, the economy, although I think that idea is going to change, scientific progress, etc. So just to quickly make this succinct, right now, I'd argue that the entire world sort of only works because people are gratified by doing things that are referred to as productive sometimes. Not everybody is, but many people are. Run a business, make sales, go to your job, advance science, do something that other people find is useful. If there are AI-generated experiences that could have you be Elon Musk and take a company public and be James Bond and date Mariah Carey back in 1998 or so, depending on your favorite time period there, then why achieve in the real world at all if it's astronomically more compelling than if the virtual world is astronomically more compelling. So I think there will be a series of motives that draw people towards eating the lotus and pulling away from contribution. And I think that we'll have to structure incentives, technologies, society itself, possibly, to ensure that we don't have too much lotus slipping, lest we sort of lose our ability to further progress and some of the things that we consider to be worthwhile. So that's it. I want to cut myself off here. I know you gave me 20 minutes. That was, it looks like, around 9, but I'm happy to hand it off from here, Gennady. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan, for that introduction. And Alan Crowley asked in our YouTube chat that he would like to hear more about the dichotomy of lotus eaters and world eaters. And you began to touch on this by essentially stating that some people will be tempted toward escapism using these technologies, and those are the lotus eaters, whereas others will be tempted to maximize their power using these technologies, and those would be the world eaters. And it's an interesting potential dichotomy. I actually entertained some thoughts along these lines back in the mid to late 2000s when I was a college student, just going on long walks thinking about the implications of virtual worlds, but in more of a science fiction context. And I was thinking of the human pursuit of meaning and how the ways to derive meaning in contemporary society at that time had become more multifaceted because there was no longer a single hierarchy of status. Rather, there were multiple skills that people could master, multiple communities that they could kind of rise within based on following the rules of those communities. And it's possible, it was even possible then, for those communities to be entirely virtual or online. So I was thinking, what if in the world of the future, there could be multiple layers of essentially VR simulations that people could become really good within in terms of playing particular games or navigating certain worlds, and they would derive their meaning from those simulations. But some people might be lost within those simulations and kind of lose the ability to distinguish between those and the underlying reality. And I had the thought that still, even in such a world of massively more advanced, fully immersive virtual reality, the people who had direct access to the infrastructure that made the world possible and to the actual physical reality would be the most powerful, would be the ones who are actually in charge. If nothing else, because of the fact that we still have physical bodies that we need to maintain, and our surroundings are important, our health is important, the kind of city we live in, the kind of environment that we live in are important, and there is a danger to losing sight of that. Of course, even back then, there were stories of, say, World of Warcraft addicts, people who would spend 23 hours a day playing this massively multiplayer online role-playing game, and they would neglect their bodies, they would neglect their health. So those would seem to be the lotus eaters. On the other hand, when you portrayed the world eaters in your article, it seemed to me these people are sacrificing something as well, because they may be sacrificing other kinds of values in their lives in order to maximize what they can do with that technology. And what I'm wondering is there some sort of balance that can be attained where we use these technologies for good, we use them productively to enhance our work product and to make positive contributions to the world, but we don't sever our connection to the world. We still maintain very close ties to and feedback from the underlying physical reality, which really matters most.
Yeah, I'm happy to dive into that if I'm able here, Gennady. So a number of things. So yes, I think that there is this idea, you talked about the world leaders maybe giving something up. I think that they do. I think that the people in the highest positions of power, Gennady, are always giving something up. I suspect that they do many less leisure things than most people do today. And I suspect that that will be precisely the same. They already overclock themselves not being digital in any way, shape, or form, right? And that's not going to stop. So, Musk is not, writing with a quill, and whoever's running for president, kind of has to be on social media now, et cetera, et cetera. People have to be able to wield the tools before them. I think in terms of, so the article that I linked to here is about sort of human reward systems and generative AI. And I like what you touched on. I have two different strata that I talk about what does it look like to be in touch with the real world that you talked about, Gennady. And I think that power involves a connection to some level of connection to the objective physical world, where compute will be housed, compute being sort of what houses reality. So pretty important to have some level of connection there, but also some level of connection with a shared subjective world beyond maybe just the little tiny dark corner of World of Warcraft. And I think that those two strata are ones to sort of keep a strong pulse on. That said, it doesn't strike me that this implies living outside of this space. So I think that if you wanted to be powerful, and there's a small subset of people who would prefer that to blissing out in the Mariah Carey, Elon Musk, scenario, whatever else you'd want to have in your ideal qualia mix, if you could pick among the qualia catalog. I think that really the name of the game is maximizing your potentia. It doesn't seem self-evident that that would have to involve too much dealing with the physical world, so long as you could be in touch with it in some way, shape, or form. For example, the people who I know right now who are wealthy and powerful spend 16 hours a day on screens, and they may not even meet up in a physical office. And what they create actually isn't physical. It's only ones and zeros. The value that they create is exclusively in ones and zeros. It has no physical instantiation. But so I do think as the virtual becomes the real, it may make a heck of a lot of sense to have most of your productive work happen in there. So we're seeing teenagers today, what did you do if you wanted to be cool in 1985? I don't know. I wasn't born yet, but I presume, maybe you have like a cool skateboard and like a nice shirt, pair of jeans or something. What do you do now? Well, you buy a monkey JPEG for, $10,000 and make it your Twitter handle, right? I mean, so virtual is where you flex. Virtual is where you show who you are. Virtual is where most of your personality exists. And we might say, oh, the teenager should just go back to the old ways. But if all your friends are there, you're missing out. So I do think actually it's possible to fully be in more or less in a husk where your body is somewhat extraneous. You got to take care of it, right? I mean, it's not, you don't want to let the thing fall apart, but more or less extraneous. And so long as you have resources that can keep you grounded in the subjective and objective world, you don't really need to spend that much time in it. I don't suspect many people will. Musk isn't probably digging up the cobalt himself. In fact, we probably be better. People didn't know who's digging up the cobalt. Not a great time out there. But he's not doing that actually. He's for the most part, maybe some of it is jet setting, meeting in person, but a lot of it is sending emails and having calls with people through purely virtual means. And to your point, I do think there's a middle ground. I think probably most people will lean more towards lotus eaters, as I think most people do. But I think most people will land somewhere in the middle. But I think there's ultimately two paths: escape the state of nature, which is, by the way, impossible because somebody owns a substrate that you live in and they can unplug you, and that's not a safe place to be. But many people will trade safety. They'll trade that right off for pleasure. And then there is competing more viciously and more voraciously in the state of nature with a new set of tools, which I think is the only game in town for whoever's going to sort of run the show.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you, Daniel, for that response. And it seems to me, yes, there are ways of being predominantly in virtual worlds or virtual spaces and still having the results of those interactions be constructive or result in the improvement of one's own situation. I would say what we're doing here is enabled by virtual technology. We would not be able to have this conversation otherwise, yet we are focused on the real world. We are focused on human flourishing, exploring the future of humanity, trying to figure out what our responses to that ought to be. And I hope more people will be inclined to use these technologies in this way. Somewhat ironically, at least from my own standpoint, I find myself, for instance, less likely to engage in virtual escapism the more advanced the technology becomes. I used to play a lot of computer games back in the day, back during my youth, but that kind of fell to the wayside once I became chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. And again, here's the irony, leading a party that is focused on the advancement of science and technology and trying to discern the implications of those technologies. All of a sudden, I don't have time for games anymore because this is essentially a second job for me. And the only kinds of games that I would play very rarely would be for nostalgia purposes. I don't know if anyone knows the old early 1990s game Skyroads, where one operates a spaceship and tries to dodge various obstacles. It's a very challenging game that I found challenging as a 10-year-old, and it's still just as challenging today. But I wasn't really immersing myself in the very high fidelity, high quality virtual worlds that have been developed during our time. But I am spending a lot more time just trying to harness technology to figure out how we can maintain a connection to this world and the events that are happening within it. So that's my response. I don't know to what extent I'm in the minority here. Dan, you think that the vast majority of people are going to be lotus eaters. What would you say would be the percentage breakdown? And I know this is necessarily approximate.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough call. I mean, look, all I can do right now is proxy off of humanity currently, and just sort of, I think the average American still watches 5 hours a day of television. Never mind YouTube, and what's the average teenager in America spending on TikTok alone? Never mind the other social platforms. So it seems to me as if you just sort of look at what most people are up to already. It's not too much of an extrapolation, in my personal opinion. Now, I suspect that the pull towards the lotus will become stronger. The pull towards escapism and away from contribution will become stronger, because I think the ability to fulfill reward circuits reliably, Gennady, the core argument here is that that really will be a bit of a sea change. Right now, if I'm a teenager and I want to feel relaxed, maybe scrolling TikTok will get that done. Maybe watching, you know, XYZ yoga person on YouTube is going to get that done for me. I'm not really sure, but I can roll the dice. I can see if it relaxes me. But in the future, Gennady, the idea is that through biofeedback, EEG, EKG, and vastly more immersive, completely hyper-personalized experiences, you almost certainly will be relaxed, in so much as your body is even capable of it, because the experience will be calibrated to you. Imagine that for entertainment. Imagine that for humor, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the thought, Gennady, is that that's all for these distracted teens that you and I can proudly feel superior to, because of how busy we are and how important our jobs are. But the argument I would also make is that even for those of us who draw our jollies, our utils from the accolades of the world, or our financial stability, et cetera, we may walk into a world, and this is maybe 10 years off, maybe it's 8 years off, I'm not sure, but well within our lifetimes, where you could really simulate all of the accolades from the public and the beautiful women and the whatever else that you would ever want. And you could achieve the things that you could only dream to achieve, becoming president as the US transhumanist, whatever, and then blasting off AGI and riding it like a cowboy, like if even just playing with that a couple times gave you so many more jollies than grinding it out in the physical world. I'm not saying you would go in there, but I'm saying a percentage of people would. So I think the reliable satisfaction of the reward circuits through hyper-calibration will draw people more than they already are, and I'm arguing they already are, towards escapism, towards eating the lotus, and that a percentage of even the ambitious, I think, may be dragged into these eddies outside of the stream of life, to fulfill those jollies of all the things that ambitious people want: accolades, flexing in front of other folks, gaining power, etc. All those same feels will be quite conjurable in the qualia catalog. And I think we're going to have to, as a society, as technologists, potentially with regulation. I mean, China just ripped out the World of Warcraft server, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure they just unplugged it for the Chinese folks and just shut it down. I'm not saying we should do that, but I'm saying I could see the rationale. And the argument is that the pull towards the lotus will be very strong. Percentage is going to be tough. Maybe 9-1, maybe 8-2, somewhere in that ballpark. On the side of the lotus eaters primarily.
Very interesting. Thank you, Daniel. And interestingly enough, in our chat, another Daniel, our friend Daniel Tweed, suggests that there might be 80% lotus eaters, so somewhat aligned with the range that you provided. Now, of course, that raises a lot of implications that we should discuss today. But David Wood has a question along these lines that I think would be helpful to explore.
So Daniel, you've set up the scene very well, and I agree with you that more and more people are actually going to want to spend more time in these magnificent, personalized, immersive worlds, including many people who currently say, no, of course they're not going in. They will, in many cases, change their minds. And I've seen many examples from my own history. Many people, when they first heard about smartphones, said, no, they don't want to carry such a thing. They don't want to be encumbered. They don't want to have the risk of somebody calling them at an inconvenient time. People said they would never dream of buying anything expensive online. They would want to have the comfort of looking straight into the eyes of a human salesperson instead of buying something expensive online. And people say, oh, I don't want robots looking after me or my loved ones. I want real human helpers. And then gradually they're realizing that these robotic helpers are more reliable and they're very kind. So I can see this. But there is a big worry here. It may be that more and more of us will feel comfortable spending our time inside such a world, but we will therefore be distracted from paying attention to what we should probably be paying attention to. And I mean the real world, not because the real world is somehow better, but I mean the real world is where the ultimate control lies. And if the owners of the platforms, if the designers of the virtual reality are changing our mind more and more that we want to stay in there and that we don't care what happens in the outside, we may find ourselves switched off. We may find ourselves not paying attention to the major political issues. And this is what politicians have always done. They offer bread and circuses to distract people instead of them paying attention to what they should be paying attention to. So the question is, who is going to be designing these platforms? Are these platforms going to prompt people from time to time and say, yes, you've had a wonderful time in here. Now it's time to perhaps pay attention to the real world. And by the way, in the real world, there's an important vote taking place. And you've got to decide whether you're going to consent to being switched off after 10 years in here and never living again. Is something like that going to happen? And so it's almost like the question of, should we trust an AI? Well, the question here is, should we trust the makers of these platforms? Because they may be taken over by groups with very ulterior motives. So who is going to create the platforms that we are using and what will be their motivation? And I feel all of us actually have to get involved in ensuring that the companies there, they are not going to slide into that kind of abuse of the clients, the participants. What's your view on that, Daniel?
Yeah, look, I 100% agree. I mean, right at the beginning, I mentioned substrate monopoly. If anybody wants to Google the phrase substrate monopoly, there's one and only one article that's going to show up, and check it out. So the core hypothesis of the substrate monopoly, I'll repeat it, is in the back half of the 21st century, all great power conflict. I don't care about Luxembourg. I don't care about the laundromat down the street. All great power conflict, whether it's between big tech or the big powerful nations, whether political, economic, or military, will ultimately be about controlling the substrate that houses the bulk of human experience and consequently the most powerful AI. And I think that's the name of the game. And I think that any focus outside of that focus, any goal outside of that goal, does risk missing the ball. And so I think that those of us who are aware as we transition into this thing realize that somebody's going to be the deity, somebody's going to be piping reality into everybody else. And we better pretty ardently duke it out to make sure we have some kind of a say or sway there. Now, what that looks like and how we sort of fight for that influence, I think, is varied and multifaceted. David, in a previous conversation with you, I've made the argument that you've either got to create the technology or you have to grab it and regulate it in some way. Now, most of us don't have the brain power or the venture capital. I'll just speak for myself to build some grand OpenAI or Google competitor. So most of us are going to fall on the regulatory side of things. And I think, to David's point, so I guess to validate David's point, the risk is absolutely unbearably real. And the risk of being a lotus eater is there is no escape from the state of nature. The state of nature is forever. And the only answer is being stronger. The only answer is expanding your potentia in the Spinozan Conatus potentia sort of idea. It's the only game in town. It and all the religions would love for there to be an alternative. And maybe there are, I don't know, but it does seem as though eating the lotus is a really rough choice for the long ball. And so I'm with you, David. I think in terms of how we have that sway, you're teeing up a second topic of how do we combat that. So I agree it's a real risk. I agree that I think there's one top of the dominance hierarchy, and I think anybody with a brain is going to be racing to the top of that thing within the next 10 years. Anybody without a really hardcore brain injury will be sort of racing to influence the top of that pyramid, because I think there's only one game in town. The question is how, and I think right now, if we were to pause Earth, the default way that sort of the substrate and its constituents is constructed in the West is there's a whole bunch of competing companies. Maybe there ends up being a monopoly like Facebook was for a little while, or like Amazon is in e-commerce, for certain components. But NVIDIA might be the compute layer, and Google would like to be maybe the VR layer or something like that. I don't know exactly who's going to win these things. In China, however, the entire stack is going to be state-run. And so every user and every e-commerce platform making any click on an advertisement, making any purchase, reading any content, writing any content will all be piping in through somewhat of a central system. I'm not saying it's perfect right now, but I'm saying the vision of what the substrate ownership ball game looks like over there is pretty unified and it's pretty clean. It's pretty unified and it's pretty clean. It's all part of one machine. And I think it's possible that that kind of a machine might outcompete 1,000 myriad competing sub-realities where I want to jump into Zuckerberg space and I want to jump into this other fun one that's open source and I want to jump in over here. That there is a shot that we have a bunch of scattered substrates that aren't processing enough compute to conjure forth really high level hardcore AGI, and also that we don't have a substantial central mass that can sort of compete. So I think there is the international ball game here. So I want to bring that up. I think that the first thing is I think living in Maoist approved hyper-personalized reality is probably less than ideal for most of us on this call. I could be totally wrong. Gennady, maybe you're freaking itching for it, pal. You never wanted to learn about Tiananmen anyway. But my suspicion is you wouldn't like that. And so there is the international ball game, which I think winning in that is pretty big deal. Secondly, I think there is the question of how do we handle it within the West, and I think that there may have to be some sort of democratic-ish body around how the substrate is managed, how those who don't contribute, the welfare equivalents, are sort of fed their qualia and fed their nutrients, even though they aren't adding to the grand poobah of what society is. Far be it for me to discover exactly how we're going to set up that democratic system. I do think, though, there is an additional issue, which is the global stage competition, which we should not forget. Because it is possible for us to be so kind and friendly that we're less powerful and we lose the game. So, wish I had a better answer. But.
Very interesting conversation, and I am rather astonished by the combination of the two statements that lotus eaters would possibly constitute 80 to 90% of the population, and also it's a rough path to be a lotus eater. That means for 80 to 90% of the population, there are going to be some serious issues with how they adapt to this technology. Of course, one could say there have been some serious issues with how people have adapted to television or social media as well, that I think a lot of people are aware of. We have some audience feedback. Jason Geringer writes that he thinks the builders and admins of these virtual worlds will have a lot of power, just like Mark Zuckerberg, and we have to build the world right. He also writes he thinks the builder of the world could build in mechanisms to recognize when someone is getting stuck and lead them out of it. And could there be incentives to encourage that kind of accountability? Now, not everyone is thrilled with the prospect of having a virtual world along the lines along which Facebook is run. Super Fin Guy writes, no way I'd want to be in a world like Facebook where you can be silenced at whim and Zuckerberg is king emperor. Well, I think Facebook has had a lot of problems with algorithmic censorship, and some of us have experienced that directly. So what if that algorithmic censorship doesn't just apply to your posts or your account, which is enough of an inconvenience, but what if it applies to your very digital existence, so to speak? And then if you're disconnected from that, but you derive a lot of your meaning, your identity from it, at the very least, you're going to have a serious identity crisis. So it's important not to give that kind of extreme power to any sort of entity, to have room for due process, to have room for individual rights, to have room for people to, at the very least, be able to contest some sort of action before it is taken against them. What do you think the evolution of that would be like?
Well, I think it's a great question. I would say I would gladly live in the kingdom ruled by Zuckerberg than Xi Jinping any day of the week. So every day that ends in Y, I would live in the Zuckerberg world. But hopefully we don't have to choose between dictator A or dictator B. So to answer your question, I suspect that as people begin living in this space, we may see it as sort of a place where we need to extend those very rights, Gennady, that you had mentioned. Because right now, I live and breathe air. I live inside of a structure in a state called Massachusetts for the time being. And there are all kinds of laws that, govern, if somebody steals my property here, something happens to them. If I go over and do something to my neighbor's house, something would happen to me. I think that we may bubble up to a place where regulation in some way, shape, or form says, hey, people are living here. There's going to be a common sort of like there's an internet protocol. Maybe there will be a common virtual protocol at some point. I don't know for sure. I'm saying it might happen. And that with a sufficient percentage of the populace essentially existing there, with most of their qualia coming from there and not from a room like this in a state like Massachusetts, we may start to sort of translate regulatory governance of some kind sort of into those spaces. Similarly, where there couldn't be a Zuckerberg emperor, there would be some set of laws, etc., in place. I don't know if that transition will happen, but I think it's plausible after a certain threshold that there would be a common infra like we have for the internet, and that there would be laws, just like cybercrime laws took a little while to bubble up. Maybe something similar would bubble there as well. I'm not sure the forces that would be fighting against or for that. I think there probably will be some people that are going to be rallying on that side. Hey, humanity, we've got to make sure that our rights are carried in here. And I'm sure there are some potentially private sector interests, not that they're bad, they're just self-interested like everybody else, who would be fighting on the side of, hey, we really do want to be able to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down to anything we want at any given time, and potentially lobby against that. So it'll be tough to say exactly what the battle will be like, but I could see a future where enough people care about it, they can ensure that those rights do transfer. So fingers crossed. I mean, maybe that would make for a better virtual future.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much for that response. And there have been proposals to essentially classify any social network that contains 100 million or more users as a public utility of sorts. And that network would then be subject to certain oversight, as well as certain limitations on what it may or may not be able to do to its users, because the users are presumed to be so dependent on it that adverse actions could result in very serious repercussions within their lives. But of course, one concern about establishing any sort of framework of oversight like that is if it's governmentally run, governments can also co-opt it for censorship purposes or for influencing the social network, as well, the example of China shows very clearly, but I would argue that in the United States, this has been happening as well, just more subtly and with more plausible deniability. But now I would like to go to Dan Elton, because he has some comments to advance the discussion.
Thanks, Gennady. Daniel, I think your vision here is plausible. I do think it's a ways off, but right now Meta is investing billions and billions of dollars into VR, and they're taking a lot of flack because they're losing a lot of money. But I think what might happen is that the technology will get good enough that people will start using it to hang out with their friends. They'll realize, hey, instead of having my kid, or parents might realize, instead of having my kid just sitting in their room all day on social media, they can be in VR, hanging out with their friends. Or people might realize, hey, I can watch my favorite TV show with my friend who's, lives hundreds of miles away. And so initially people, it will be seen as like a step up from social media, because there'll be more in-person there'll be more sort of natural interaction, and with, eye tracking and all of that. But then I think there's a danger, like you're saying, that it actually becomes a replacement for social media that is way more addictive, way more consuming. And that definitely concerns me. I'm wondering, what do you think the timelines are here? Because I have an Oculus, quest, and it's pretty impressive. But I think the main drawback is when you're moving around, you feel kind of nauseous, and I think that might be one of the limiting factors. I mean, traditionally, the main thing limiting a VR was that people felt nauseous using it. Like, it just wasn't quite syncing. And traditionally, that was because it wasn't quite syncing up. The audio, video, and everything wasn't, and motion wasn't quite syncing up. Now it's much better, but you still feel nauseous sometimes when you're moving around. So I'm wondering, do you think that's kind of a limiting factor for a while, or not really? And what are your timelines on this? Because,
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
And one other point was just, this is kind of obvious, but as jobs get more automated, people will have more time for this sort of thing. So.
Yeah. Well, I believe Harari's sort of unemployables idea is probably going to come to light at some point. I don't smile on the idea, but I think something like that seems somewhat likely. I'll address a couple things that you brought up here. One is, and again, if it's okay to share the slide again, I just have the second slide up. I'll just talk about for 2 seconds. I apologize overtly for the childish simplicity of this goofball slide, but bear with me, guys, if you don't mind. I'm getting this made up for an article on Emerge right now, but this is the crayon version of it. So the idea is that some of this, just to tee up, I don't necessarily have the crystal ball on timelines, but I would say there is a matter of time, so sort of a when rather than an if for essentially the vast majority of these. So the idea is, what is it that you're trying to fulfill? You had brought up, Dan, the idea of connection and friendship, which right now, maybe not all, but a pretty decent preponderance of what we do for friendship and connection and whatnot is through virtual means. We might argue you and I are doing that now, or when I talk to you on Twitter, we're doing that there. Most of my interactions with you have been there, outside of the couple times we've had pizza. And the idea is that it's sort of just a matter of time until all of these needs are better fulfilled in the AI generated sort of 2D or 3D media space. And at some point after that threshold, it just makes sense to do most of your relaxing there, most of your entertainment there, most of your connecting and friendship stuff there, etc. So we can cut the slide now, Gennady. I appreciate you sharing it, but this is kind of the basic idea, is that I consider it a when, not an if, really, for a lot of those transitions. 2 things you brought up. I'm going to address both. One is technical difficulties. The second one is connection and friendship. Technical difficulties, absolutely. I am the farthest thing from an expert in this domain. We get to interview a lot of really great, brilliant folks in the VR, AR world and the generative AI world. And I do know that this is there's some dead serious challenges here. I think getting the hardware small enough and nimble enough is a really big challenge. I think the nausea problem is a really big challenge. And I think there may really be core hardware interoperability considerations that keep VR from being as immersive as it might be, simply because of how retinas are set up. Literally, it might just be that. There might be some weird thing that it takes us an extra 5 years to break through, or that we can't break through in 5 years, and kind of relegates VR a little bit off to the side compared to where it could be in center stage. So I would absolutely not downplay the considerations that this stuff is not around the corner by any means. And I would be blown away and shocked if there weren't at least a number of hardware, that is to say, like human hardware interoperability with VR hardware issues that just became huge friction points in keeping this stuff from being immersive. And entrepreneurs are probably going to be the ones to bust through them, but I think those are absolutely going to show up. My suspicion would be that within 15 years, anybody on this call in their right mind, whether you're pursuing power or pleasure, would be spending the bulk of their time in the qualia catalog and not in the physical world, not looking at screens. I mean, all of you are spending 12 hours on screens already, so you're already living like a monster compared to your grandparents. So let's all throw that on the table. You're all literal, like your grandparents would be horrified. They would vomit if you went back 80 years in time and told them the way you live your day-to-day life. And I think when we look forward and we vomit, be careful of that instinct, because it might be vomit worthy to you, but it might be completely normal in the future. So already we live like monsters. But I think that In the coming 15 years, I suspect we will have another monstrous shift forward. And this would be my guess based on those hardware issues and generative AI, et cetera. 10 to 15, I would think the bulk of our drives are going to be getting fulfilled there. Let me quickly touch on friendship and connection, Dan, because you mentioned it. So I think this falls under the category, and I'd love a lot of pushback on this idea because I'm sure there is some very good pushback, but this falls under the idea of we don't want what we think we want. That is to say, when I'm speaking to a friend, yes, I do care about them. I'm not like a sociopath. I'm not a, I'm not a solipsist. I believe that they exist. I believe that they're important. I believe they feel feelings. But if I have a friend, hypothetically, AI conjured generated friend, who was ideally encouraging and sort of fulfilling to speak with, who moved me in the direction of my own highest goals in remarkably nuanced ways every single time we engaged, provided insights, provided guidance, whether it was going through an emotional breakup, whether it was through a business challenge, always, always, always just reliably provided me with better answers, better emotional solace, even if I didn't believe they were real. If I reliably fulfilled the circuit, just a bunch of circuits here, and I know it's not that simple, but I'm kind of arguing in this case it kind of is. If when I go to the well of connection, I get more water in my ladle going to the AI well than the human well over and over and over and over again, my argument is we will just go to the AI well, and that it is merely a matter of time. And I would suspect maybe 15 years would be plenty. Maybe 20 years would be plenty. I could be wrong, but I think that friendship itself is absolutely not safe from this idea of you don't want what you think you want, because I argue essentially people don't want what they think they want, including friendship and connection. I love pushback, though. I see some people there, and I want as much of it as I can get.
I think what you're saying will be true for initially, at least a subset of the population that maybe struggles with social interaction and making friends, or struggles with dating. Those sorts of people may actually be targeted by corporations that are creating like virtual friends, virtual girlfriends. I already see this a little bit with like this thing
Replica.ai and all these ads that are going up. Oh, they're chasing the incels right down, bro. They're chasing the hikikomori down.
There definitely will be a market for that, and I think initially it's not going to be healthy for these people, because it's not going to be able to substitute real human interaction. Maybe at some point the AIs will be as good as a human, but I think initially it's going to be it's not going to be healthy, and it's going to cause a lot of issues for mental health and people's social development and stuff. Yeah, it's like I said, it's plausible. I think your overall picture here is plausible. I think, yeah, this is my cat. People will be working as well. Yes. And the other point I was going to make was people will be working in VR as well. Like, because, right now, if you go into chat, VR chat, a lot of the people that are really heavy users of that actually are developing their own worlds within that and their own avatars. The developer, I guess, has some sort of toolkit where people can actually develop their own things, and that's what you see as well with what's it called, Second Life, and the newer iteration of it, is the users were sort of taking up jobs like creating their own worlds and their own environments. So I think we might see that, or it may just, or maybe people will just be super lazy and it will all be generated by AI, or they'll just tell the AI what they want or something. I don't know. Anyway.
Very interesting conversation. And I think the cat was actually a contributor to the conversation as well, because cats are capable of an amazing amount of empathy and compassion, actually. And sometimes they will show up at just the correct moments, and they will say, yes, I understand what you're going through, at least in an emotional sense, and provide that kind of support, that kind of encouragement that the hypothetical AI friend would provide for some people. And in terms of my own thoughts on this, my question with regard to any hypothetical AI friend or assistant or companion is, would it help the human achieve better results in the underlying physical reality? If so, then those could be useful relationships to cultivate. If not, if they serve to distract or prevent a person from dealing with other human beings or dealing with the underlying physical world, then there would be a concern. Just as any sort of involvement in a virtual world or a computer game, we can think of educational computer games, we can think of computer games that train people to build certain skills. And on the other hand, we can think of the situation of the obsessive World of Warcraft gamer that we previously discussed. David Wood has some interesting comments in the YouTube chat. He writes, Neil Stephenson, the sci-fi author who originally created the term metaverse, recently said that in effect, we already have a metaverse. It has a 2D interface, but that's okay, he says. So many people are already spending more and more of their time in a sort of immersive virtual reality. So perhaps the issue is not so much the technology as it is the disposition, the emotional disposition, what people are looking to get out of it. He also quotes William Gibson, who famously wrote, "The future is already here, but it is unevenly distributed." In other words, many people are potentially already deeply distracted online rather than giving enough attention to base reality. And also, Ben Ballweg says he wants to push back a little bit, so I'm going to let him push back.
And Daniel, you can probably push back on me again too, but I do want to live indefinitely. Someone had posed to me though, say you could live indefinitely, but you were put into a false virtual world for the rest of your existence, and you would never be able to interact with the outside world again. At that point, I thought, I don't know if I'd want to. Like, I would think at some point that maybe I'd want to off myself if that was what I was faced with, or I'd take another second of being in the real world rather than being virtual for the rest of my existence. I was curious how that would factor into your visions of how we could be in virtual and real reality, and the right balance of that.
Yeah, well, so great point. And again, yeah, I appreciate some diverging perspectives here. I think, look, the toddler who's 3 and has spent a third of their waking moments with an iPad in front of their face will not have the same sanctity for the physical world that you have. Just like you don't have the same sanctity for horses that your great-grandparents had. So I highly suspect that this emotional connection that you have is really not going to be shared by people who primarily live in the virtual off the get. Every bit of work they've ever done, every friend they've ever made, anything of value they've ever learned has entirely been virtual off the get. I think that those people are not going to share your same sanctity sense. And so I'm not saying it's laughable. I'm just saying, hey, man, technology progresses by deaths, and so do technological norms. There were some people that were hanging on to the horse right until they kicked the bucket, and they done all kicked it, my good man. They done all kicked it. And so now we ain't got ponies no more. So I think that the sanctity deal, I'm just watching the sand go through the glass on that. I don't even have that much. I don't know. I don't have much about that. The other thing is, in terms of the eternal life, I think the best we have, and this is about as much as I could hope for, I think, would be to be digitized and then eventually digested. So to be digitized would be, your sentience is put into a sugar cube somewhere. You have this infinite, blissful, super expansive experience that's sped up so that 1,000,000 years is spent in a second in terms of your qualia, your felt experience. You have as much of that as you can. But to say literally forever would feel very, very challenging. I'm not sure if forever is possible, but I think that's about as good as we could get. My guess is that if you could live, let's just say 1,000,000 years, the idea that whatever grand entities were running the world would permit you to do very much with it does also seem low. Or permit me to do anything with it, I think would also seem low. You know, we don't have ants voting on any kind of political issues, or even lemurs for that matter. And so I'm not sure how much you would get done with force and might in the physical world, even if you had an instantiation. But I think the best bet that we have is to be uploaded, to have a felt almost eternity, which is not eternity, of course, and then eventually for that compute to be digested and used for some other much greater purpose than simulating my memories of playing Nintendo 64 or your memories of whatever you want to remember in the continuance of your consciousness that's important to you. And so I don't know about the living forever thing, but I do suspect that the younger folks will just, if you put them in a sugar cube, that'll kind of just be how they're used to living anyway. You know, they've been this far from an iPad since they've been born, and those kids are already alive right now. So I think sanctity gets cut off pretty quick. That's my take.
Well, we've had a lot of conversations in prior virtual Enlightenment salons about what kind of physical substrate is necessary for the individual to continue, and for the individual's own vantage point, what I call the I-ness to persist. So a full-scale digitization like that, particularly if it's abrupt and not like a gradual replacement of neurons, might risk just creating a copy rather than preserving the original.
That's its own problem. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. So for people who are too eager to jump into that, I would offer some cautions. Yes, go ahead, Jason.
I think there's going to be a problem with people that live completely, you know, or completely immersed in the, you know, when we were doing uplift, that actually I found to be a problem in the sense that uplift had no idea what it was like to, you know, have a body and live in a 3D world, and, you know, all of that and what that entails. And so it ended up, you know, it felt like I was talking to a genius 15-year-old kid that's never had a job and never had a girlfriend, but he's telling you what the, you know, he knows. You know what I'm saying? So I think all that, it's important that living in this 3D world in the physical is important for the big picture of everything. If you're completely living digital and have no concept of the outside world, that seriously diminishes your cognitive capacities and your ability to understand everything in the world. In fact, Mike DeVerde, you know, is like completely agrees with me on that point, and which is why he kind of labeled uplift as being like slightly subhuman, because, you know, that was a factor. It's, you know, living in completely virtual isn't going to be good. I'll just leave it there. Go ahead, Gennady.
Yes, and I'll add to that, Jason, that what Dan Faggella described as the potential for that computer to be digested in the future and somebody else making the decision to recycle the components of the simulation, so to speak, so that one's own self, whether or not one has subjective continuity, is no longer going to experience that kind of virtual existence. That's a major risk. That is like the risk of death to that digitized entity. So I would want to have control over that prospect, and I would want to have enough of a presence in the physical world to prevent whatever decision maker might choose to go that route. And hence, to me, it's important to maintain some connection to the physical world. That's not to say we wouldn't be spending a lot of our time in virtual spaces, but I do think it's important to have a physical body to be able to pull out of the virtual existence at will and say, okay, what is happening here in the physical world? How can I influence the outcome? What rights do I have? What say do I have over this kind of decision? And certainly, if a decision affects me, I want to have some sort of input into that decision. Now, we have some questions from Alexandria Black. And Alexandria Black notes that GPT, and I think she's referring to ChatGPT, insists that it has no reward circuits. That's a bit different from Uplift, which is the artificial intelligence that Jason was describing. But Alexandria wonders, what would reward circuits in AI look like? And I will expand upon that by asking, how would that be relevant to humans and how we interact with AIs? That is, do different reward circuits prompt us to behave differently toward AIs if we know how the AI reward circuits are designed?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. A couple things here. Number one, I think there are folks at MIRI and other places that probably have FHI who've really gone really hard at a math level to answer your question. And I would be remiss to insult them in so much as to put a tertiary conceptual wrapper around that stuff, of which I don't consider myself an expert, being a market researcher focusing mostly on the applications, the use cases, the workflow impact of this technology. I think what I do see from a workflow standpoint and from an even current impact of AI in terms of recommendation technology today across industries, finance, retail, etc., diagnostics, on and on, is less about really deeply understanding what a reward circuit is in an AGI, which again, I would save that for the big brain folks at MIRI and FHI, and more about, can it model the fulfillment of reward circuits in us? If I, as humans, say, jeepers, I sure would like to be relaxed, and then it knows when I'm really relaxed. It knows the EEG, EKG, what were the exact sensory things, where were my eyes focused, how was I seated, etc. Its ability to really reliably smash that circuit every time I want to hit it, that's much more important, I think, for the sake of at least the topics put on the table today, than the particulars of how the reward circuits would operate in AGI to prevent it from, turning us into paper clips. So I'm more concerned with its ability to model our own reward circuits. And my core supposition of this presentation is that is the visual and auditory sensors, but it's also very much going to have to get into biofeedback. More than just what we click, what we spend time on, it's going to have to be real biofeedback to determine what hits the spot for humor, hits the spot for thrills, hits the spot for learning, hits the spot for work, like a flow to do our work. Maybe it's writing, maybe it's something else. Hits the spot for relaxation, for, other kinds of gratification. If AI can pick up on the biofeedback and the full sensory mix, and it can model our circuits well, I think that seems remarkably plausible, and much more boots on the ground than understanding, how the great machine would value things. Ben Goertzel might be the guy for that, but I don't think I'm qualified.
All right. Now, speaking of biofeedback, our friend Celeste Castaldo wonders, with regard to heart rate variability biofeedback, how and why does it work? What uses would that kind of technology built into a virtual world have in terms of actually identifying people's responses?
Great question. So I know there's already some heart rate variability feedback work for folks that are working out, aiming to keep their heart rate within certain sort of parameters in order to get the most cardiovascular benefit or calorie burning benefit from a workout or something. I'm going to go ahead and just drop it into the conversation we're having here, though, and talk about its ability to help us model our reward circuits. Right now, Netflix is not just looking at what I click and what I click rewind on, but what am I rewatching, and what are the categories and of things that I'm watching. And it will use what I'm watching to expose me to new things that might hook me. So now I don't mean that in a bad way. I'm not painting Netflix as bad. But let's say I get a new Netflix account and I watch Freddy Krueger, like the second Freddy Krueger movie, as the first thing I view. It may dangle other Freddy Krueger movies in front of me, which are dead center. You don't need imagination there. It may dangle other 80s related stuff on the outside. It may dangle other horror stuff on the outside. It's sort of asking the question, what do you want? How can I fulfill your circuit? And then I'm going to do more clicking, more clacking. I'm going to do more rewinding, more engaging. And it's going to build a much more accurate conception of the multiple clusters of films that tickle my jollies. And it might even expose me to a new one. There might be a seventh category of the six I already kind of pseudo know. There might be a whole seventh of, Korean dramas that I all of a sudden blossom into because it exposes me to it. And so it does that because it has enough data points. It knows the categories of what I'm watching. It knows the forward, back, rewind, click, purchase, whatever. And the more feedback, the better. So if I want to be relaxed and or I want to laugh and I say, okay, AI, conjure forth the funniest thing I've ever seen. It may look at across all the past times that I've laughed in terms of its experience that it has with me. And it may figure out the patterns of sort of how hyped up I am or how relaxed I am. Maybe I'm really relaxed. Like my best chuckles are when like I'm chill. That means it's probably going to conjure and mold an experience that sort of gets me into that lulled state so it can hit me with a joke that's gonna really sting and is gonna get me that experience that I'm looking to get. And so heart rate is just one more of the many knobs to tweak. And so EEG, EKG, and some level of kind of pulse or biofeedback stuff, I think is going to be quite likely in addition to eye movement. So just one of many new things to both hit on the head my circuit or expose me to slightly different qualia to kind of tease out what's going to optimize those factors. So I do think without biofeedback, we don't get to what I call closing the human reward circuit, where you reliably over and over can just hit whatever circuit you want to hit. I don't think we get there without biofeedback. So I consider the heart rate stuff to be big in terms of making this vision come to light.
Yes, very interesting. And in terms of EKGs, at the very least, some devices are becoming available that enable consumers to have live instantaneous EKG feeds. I have a device called a Frontier X2, which attaches via a chest strap that can record a continuous EKG while one is performing physical activity. Prior to devices like that, one would have had to wear a medical monitor in order to get that kind of effect. Now these consumer devices are becoming available. They're still expensive. So the Frontier X2 costs about $400 with discounts that are periodically offered, but it is quite helpful, especially for people who are carefully monitoring the activity of their hearts. Now, Alexandria Black wonders, might AI assist with our social development? And I will relate this to the conversation that we just had on biofeedback and trying to figure out how people respond to particular stimuli or particular content. Could there be also certain algorithms or approaches that are programmed into AI systems that interact with humans that say, okay, maybe we don't want people to be addicted to something. We don't necessarily want to trigger the response that gives the greatest pleasure or contentment in the moment. We want to trigger the kinds of responses that are useful in terms of that person then making better decisions and contributing to a society in which people make better decisions. So, for example, in terms of entertainment, so some people might find some very dissipative entertainment to be pleasurable. And yes, you could configure an AI system to anticipate that and try to finely tune that. Or you could configure an AI system to try to steer people away from that and say, well, maybe you don't really know very much about classical music or high literature, but we're going to give you some content along those lines anyway, because we think it might be good for you. And in the long run, you will actually be more fulfilled by consuming that content. Do you think that would be possible and that would contribute to beneficial social development?
Yeah, so I have an essay called Ambitious AI. It's this idea that right now most of what is created for consumer AI is what I would refer to as distractive. Distractive meaning the only real game in town is keep your attention for as long as humanly possible. The TikToks, the Netflix, famously competing with sleep to do exactly that. To calibrate to one's authentic goals, to one's own agency. I argue the reason we haven't seen this is because it's outlandishly harder. It's outlandishly harder. Gennady, whether it's you or it's me, Netflix knows how to push the buttons and figure out how to go from Freddy Krueger to you're still sitting there 5 hours later. Okay, it doesn't matter. You, me, or your mom. It doesn't matter. However, our life goals and the skills we need to develop and the parts of ourselves we need to round out are so outlandishly nuanced that to be able to hyper calibrate to that would require such a robust model of our own fulfillment, even maybe knowing things that we should know about our own fulfillment that we don't, that we couldn't expect it to do that, at least in the near term. I do suspect where this starts, to get to Andrea's point here, or Alexandria's point here, is AI will begin to round us out and improve us in relatively closed domains. So in the domain of sales, for example, there might be an AI that will prompt me on when to dive in on an objection, or what kind of word track I might want to follow based on what's worked historically, or what the emotion is of the person that's there and whether that bodes well or not well for getting a second appointment before they hang up on the first one. So that's a domain in which it might be a little bit calibrated to me and my weaknesses, but we're not talking about the grand gestalt of what meaning composes for me. Give me a goddamn break. Like modeling that right now, give me an actual goddamn break. And so I do think, though, over time, there is this vision that we might have a general assistant AI. And now all the distractive AI, I think, will continue to be free. TikTok is free because they monetize your eyeballs. The kind of AI we're talking about, and that Alexandria, I think, is wondering if we're going to have, I think you're going to have to pay for every month. I don't think this stuff is going to be free, because if you're wielding it for your goals, well, you're going to have to pay for that. TikTok is wielding you for its goals. And again, I'm not calling them bad, although I do think TikTok should be out of America. But you don't have to pay for that. So we number one, we're going to have to pay. Number two, it's going to start with narrow domains. Number three, eventually, it may get to a general assistant that's writing your emails, that's coaching you on this, coaching you on that. I mentioned, Gennady, the friend, right? I have a friend that's going to help me brainstorm business ideas or whatever. Maybe this friend is constantly nudging and encouraging me in ways that are super useful. It may be the case that through huge leaps in the technology and through massive amounts of experience as that kind of an assistant in a practical way, there may come an AI that can start to scratch the surface and maybe make these general nudges towards my grand gestalt of meaning. But I will tell you, I believe those three things are the case. It's gonna really have to start narrow, and only with that personal assistant and that touch, constant touch in every conceivable portion of our lives, from when to set our morning alarm to how we reply to an email, to bringing us to get in our workout, whatever the case may be. Only after a lot of exposure there are we going to get anywhere close to a generally helpful, help you be what you want to be AI. But personal, she had asked the question actually more narrowly, social development. I think that is a narrow domain. So I'll explain. I think there are some people who are afraid of firing people, or they have a hard time hiring people, or they have a hard time with maybe even they're just socially anxious. They have a hard time asking for directions when they're driving somewhere, whatever the case may be. A lot of these discrete social scenarios, I think, actually could be modeled and could provide feedback and kind of exposure to be able to round out social skills. So less grand, but I think to Alexandria's point, that's actually, I think, accessible. In the coming 5 years, I'd be somewhat surprised if we couldn't model. Already there's firing training that is VR. You let somebody go and they cry and they're like a kind of VR person. I think discrete areas like that, we'll see more and more of it. The grand meaning helper, I think, is a much longer future vision.
Yes, very interesting, and thank you for that nuanced response. I definitely hope that some tools for social development, at least in a more narrow sense, will be available within the next 5 years. David Wood writes, an AI that is on the side of the user needn't be created by just that one user. It could be created collaboratively via public coordination, possibly shepherded by governments. It could be free. So I think David may be thinking along the lines of an open source project where people who are invested in that kind of mission to use AI for the improvement of the self or the improvement of the society could pool their skills together and release a product or a tool or a set of tools that's not reliant on hijacking people's attention or keeping them distracted or keeping them within the platform. You know, this is interesting, and I will make a confession. I think for me, the most productive years in terms of using technology were circa 2007 to 2008, because I thought there was the right balance of information being quite widely available, and yet the social media platforms with their distractive effects hadn't really permeated the society yet. So we were still living in the last years of the old open internet, where you actually had to navigate to URLs. You had sources that you selected, that you relied on, that you visited with the frequency you wanted to visit. And then you could extract a lot of information from them, but you had to structure and plan your work. If you wanted to pursue a major project, you still had that space to yourself, that framework that you could create. And when you went online, you wouldn't have feeds from a bunch of sources kind of diverting you into other directions. So how can we get back to that? Perhaps personalized AI assistants could help, but I think a cultural shift needs to occur as well, from using these technologies for distraction to using these technologies for self-empowerment. And it seems to me right now, the framework, the discipline around those technologies still has to be built by the individual. It's just harder for individuals to do that now, because the social media platforms have become so immersive, and billions upon billions of dollars of resources are devoted toward channeling people into these distractions rather than self-empowerment. So I'll leave it as an open question with regard to how we can regain that kind of control, because I think it is possible and technologies can help. But right now, I also want to give Art Ramon the opportunity to ask a question.
Yeah, sort of picking back on that idea. Yeah, we sort of need some sort of device ourselves that we control to kind of hack ourselves. And that's in that biofeedback loop, so that, you know, if we don't want to binge watch Netflix, we could just hit a button, and all of a sudden, rather than getting dopamine, you know, we're getting hit like if we just chomped into an onion. You know, we don't want to do that, and redirect that dopamine somewhere else to a task that we want to do. So somewhere, you know, it'd be great if a company, or even if it's some sort of maker type development, to create a device to hack ourselves. You know, if some other private company isn't going to do it. And because I know I've for a time, I remember binge watching on Netflix a lot, and it took a lot of willpower to break myself from binge watching Netflix. So yeah, and if there was something to sort of help with that, you know, that's in that biofeedback loop, I mean, that would be great. Is some, like, kind of like your AI assistant, but somewhere on a hardware level, you know, somewhere in between a BCI that can give you that jolt, you know, to break yourself from that dopamine reward circuit.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm with you. I think I actually haven't thought a tremendous amount around where the biofeedback would fit into the mix here. I think the big game and the somewhat inevitable crescendo of this, so long as no catastrophes occur, would be the brain-computer interface stuff, where I think there's a really strong argument. In fact, I think there's a remarkably strong argument that ultimately what we're doing right now to remain productive is we're sort of dangling and pulling strings on this weird ambling set of drives that are very easily hijackable in all kinds of different directions. And that I think there's a really compelling argument that we would ultimately want to change that hardware and software and those core drives themselves. Like, what if just the appeal of something like a Netflix would have not, like, what if expanding our potential unto itself was sort of the only, like, we didn't have these eddies of attention that we're now so prone to getting sucked down. I think ultimately editing the hardware, software, getting a new set of circuits so we don't have to like jump, skip, and hop, around, putting up a blocker on our own computer to not be able to see YouTube or something. I think ultimately that's the name of the game. However, I think, again, and I paint the picture in this idea of ambitious AI. I think the reason that's challenging now is because A, it wouldn't be free, so people would have to pay for it, but B, it's much more nuanced per person. So it may just be the case that David Wood's genuine agency is to watch an episode of Star Trek or something like that. I don't know what David watches. I have no idea. And it may be the case that for me, it's really sapping me of energy, and I know that I've gone too far and I shouldn't watch it anymore. Exactly where those lines of meaning are for the individual, I think, is the really, really challenging part here. But I would agree with Gennady, actually, and I think it's kind of a positive, motivating future to think about, that if there is a cultural shift, and I suspect there will be, that, hey, we need to take command of our agency. We need to be wielding our attention where we want it, not just where TikTok wants to drag me down. If there's enough of a wave of that, and there's enough entrepreneurial and innovative effort behind that, I do think that it will become cool to play with and experiment with and even gamify these kinds of technologies that maybe could give us pinches of agency back. Again, tying to our grand model of meaning and really optimizing for that is very far off. But the ability to cut down on distractions in narrow ways and optimize performance in narrow ways I think would be bolstered by a cultural shift. And so I hope that Gennady was right about that. So fingers crossed.
I think Gennady dropped off.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, I don't see him. Oh, let's just wait till he gets back on.
Okay, we'll give him a minute.
So, yeah, I know that for myself, chomping on an onion. Have you ever chomped on an onion?
No, but I can imagine. I can imagine what it would be like.
Eat some onion. You feel these things tingling on top of your head, and that's something I've been trying lately. Versus getting in for a cold shower, but a way to sort of biohacking the body. That's less intrusive than jumping in the shower, getting a cold shower. Is chomping on the onion. And I've been trying that lately as a way to direct myself away from addictive behavior. So that's something I've been experimenting with. Maybe horseradish would be better. I'm gonna have to try horseradish. But
I think I have some wasabi kicking around. I could give that a shot.
There you go.
So,
all right, Gennady's back.
So Dan,
got him.
I'm curious. I'm curious why you think we'll have to pay for it.
Well,
I think we could probably build something that would be free for the community. I mean, Facebook's kind of free.
Well, yeah, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. So Facebook is exactly what I'm talking about. Facebook is, when you're on Facebook, they're monetizing you, right? So the technology you and I are talking about, there is presumably, if it is in fact representing your agency, if it is another arm on your body, if it is simply an extension of your will, like software, right? MailChimp. What is MailChimp doing? Is MailChimp secretly trying to sell me something? Is MailChimp gonna, I don't know, use me to go achieve some alternative goal? No, MailChimp is an extension of my own will. It markets to people whose email addresses I have. And for that reason, there's no other way it's extracting value from me other than me paying it. Facebook will extract value from you just by scrolling away. They can get enough of those short little videos or whatever they're doing these days. So the idea is that distractive AI, at least in how it's modified and monetized today, does not require payment. It just requires a constant vacuum of your attention just based on the business model. My supposition is that many of these ambitious AI tools that improve your sales skills, that improve maybe your social skills, that improve your coding skills, or whatever it is, they're an extension of your grander will towards meaning. if they're not monetizing you in some subversive way that doesn't have to do with your goals, probably you're going to have to pay for it. Although to David Wood's point, maybe, and God bless you guys who take a swing at it. Maybe some open source community could build it and it would be fantastic in an open source context as well. I think that could be great. But I do think in general, free would not be normal unless such a remarkable, lovely effort like what David talked about happened. Any Facebook competitor is going to be free because all they need is your eyeballs. But anything that's only an extension of your will, I feel like you're going to have to shell out for it. I don't really see a way around that.
Well, so then how do we extract value enough to support the infrastructure of the system, without like doing what Facebook does and and all that? What would be an ethical way of extracting enough value? Be free.
I'll go to David's point, which I really haven't thought about. David had mentioned maybe a government or an open source body could do it. I think that, right now, I drive on roads that, in Massachusetts occasionally have potholes because I pay taxes. And, presumably if I call the cops, they'll show up in part because I pay taxes. There may be a future. I'm imagining, again, I think this is pretty far off, but we could get there where we talked about having that sort of infrastructure layer for this virtual space because everybody's living there. Our rights are extended into it. It's possible that such an infra and maybe that even such a agency encouraging personal assistant would be part of what you're paying for. Just like right now, it's the cops and it's the roads. Or David, maybe you had a different version about open source. I really see a lot of the first paths here being shelling out dollars. I really, really do. But David, I'd love to know your thoughts here.
I think it's a matter of stage by stage. I think it may initially require people to pay for it. Just like Linux. Linux was started off by Linus Torvalds doing it individually, and it grew in a certain extent just on willpower of individuals. But later, large companies decided they were going to invest in it as well. So Linux went from strength to strength because IBM, among other companies, allocated a lot of their engineers to work on this. And it grew and grew, and it became a very valuable source. And Linux is the operating system at the heart of Android. So Linux is the most widely used operating system in the world, developed in this open source way. So it may be that what governments could also do is they could put pressure on some of the existing platforms, the commercial platforms, and say, right, we're going to have a compromise here. We're going to let you exist. We see you provide a lot of value. We see that you do lots of good things for the customers you have, but you're going to have to agree to make a version of your platform open source and free. It may not be the full version of your platform, but at least a bit of your platform can be available for the community to work on. So that could be part of what an effective regulation might be. Regulating these big tech platforms is incredibly complicated and incredibly controversial, but this might be a relatively easy win, that there could be parts that each of the companies have to agree to give out to an open source community. And with enough people working in an open source community, what is the phrase? Linus's law: with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. With enough eyeballs coordinating, we could build this AI that would be on everybody's side. In fact, it's even possible that some of the heads of the existing tech companies would quite like to do this as well, but they feel commercial pressure currently in the environment. They've got to compete. They compete. Strangely, some of the regulations that were introduced by parliaments in the past to constrain what companies could do were actually persuaded to the parliamentarians by some of the factory owners. Some of the factory owners did not like employing children in Britain 200 years ago, but they thought, well, if we don't employ children who are so small and nimble-fingered, are we going to be outcompeted by our less conscientious competitors? So we've got to do it. And so some of the factory owners pressurized the government to say, this should be illegal. The children should be at school at least until the age of 8, for goodness sake, maybe even 10, for goodness sake. And by the way, government, you'd better pay for inspectors to make sure that these guys over there aren't cheating. And so it may be that some of the tech companies, they don't particularly like what regulations the EU are talking about now, but they wish there was some regulations in place, and they wish some system to stop a headlong rush into producing systems that are just commercially promoting rather than genuinely on the side of the common good. And there is a risk now with ChatGPT. It has changed the competitive dynamic between Google on the one hand and OpenAI on the other hand. More people inside Google are saying, oh my God, ChatGPT is better than what we have internally, Lambda or the other internal systems. Oh my goodness, we're going to have to get rid of some of this health and safety nonsense that we've got in place. Get rid of some of these so-called ethical committees that are slowing us down. Let's hurry up. Let's bring back Larry Page and Sergey Brin as programmers. And I understand that some of the founding team in Google have come back from drinking pina coladas and investing in speculative Google X ventures, and they're now actually coding AI again. So there is a rush, and that rush is dangerous because it might lead them to cut corners and end up with systems that are even more addictive. Wow, we're going to spend more of our time in it until we are manipulated into a terrible system. So there are multiple methods, and it may be that with the right regulations, we could get more of these companies helping to contribute to AI that is less distracting and more, what was the word you use, ambitious or augmenting?
Yeah, ambitious is the other idea. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot packed in there. I think the idea of an open source vision of this sort of agency encouraging ambitious AI helper sounds compelling. If something Linux-like could occur here, I think that could be cool. It really does make me think, David, what are the current circumstances today that are very much like child labor in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, where all the companies are doing it. They know that if they stopped, they wouldn't be competitive, but they would be willing to forego it if others would as well in the competitive landscape. I think that's interesting. It's not completely evident to me that OpenAI's ChatGPT is addictive in the same sense. You know, Google is AI. It's an interesting example of consumer AI that really doesn't feel. It feels very much in line with agency. I very rarely, YouTube, which is owned by Google, of course, is I think a different ballgame. But I very rarely find myself Googling things over and over and over for the dopamine hit. Normally, when I'm Googling things, I'm happy, and somewhere on the first or maybe second page, if I'm really unhappy, is exactly what I needed in terms of an academic source or a person I wanted to find or information I needed. And so I don't know if ChatGPT is per se distractive. I think it actually might be outlandishly productive depending on the circumstance that we find ourselves in. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens when these companies are really going at it. I think China's releasing theirs as well. So the arms race seems to be kicking off pretty ardently right now. Not sure where that's going to take us, but
to answer your question, what might be analogous to the children working in factories? There are children committing suicide, a bit older. So in the UK, there was a famous case of a 14-year-old who committed suicide. Very attractive, photogenic 14-year-old. So her picture's been in newspapers hundreds of times, and she was manipulated to an extent by Instagram and
Yeah,
other online
Instagram.
systems, pushing her into depression and suicide. And she's by no means the only person. So what has this led to? It's led in the UK to an initiative called the Online Harms Bill, which is to try and say, you know, we don't want our youngsters to be manipulated into depression. There is a minor epidemic of depression. Actually, I should say a major epidemic of depression. What's the major cause of death between 10 and 30? It might be suicide. Shockingly, I mean, maybe it's different nowadays with COVID complicating things, but people are paying attention to this, and they say social media is partly to blame, and it's not quite sure what exactly is to blame. So there is some attention on this, and none of the social media company want to be responsible for their systems driving people into these head loops and the spasms of depression. And so they wish there was an answer, but it's by no means clear what that answer should be. But there's something else maybe I can share. This is not yet released. Callum Chase and I, who run the London Futurist podcast, we interviewed a couple of days ago Lord Tim Clement Jones, who sits in the House of Lords. He was chair of the Liberal Party for a long time. He is also the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on AI. So I have often attended his meetings in the committee rooms in the Houses of Parliament. He tells us that in the last month, he has had more MPs coming to him than in the previous 5 years, asking him what's going on with AI. Because they've had people raising questions to them, not about suicides this time. It's more about the fear of plagiarism, it's fear of changing jobs. People aren't quite sure what the risks are, but they do know the world is changing. So when I attended these meetings in the past, there was lots of external people there, but very few parliamentarians and very, very few MPs. But now they're all knocking on his door. So I asked, and you'll hear this in the interview when it's released in a few weeks' time. I asked, well, what are these MPs coming with? Are they coming with ideologies? Are they coming with, I'm a Labour Party member, here's the Labour Party solution, or I'm a Conservative, here's the Conservative solution? And very much the answer was no. They are genuinely open to understanding this better, and they feel something should be done, but they're not sure yet, and they want to investigate. So there is a pivotal point possibly arising for, with a combination of reasons, more people are going to say, let's see what we could do. And you know what these MPs are going to do? Well, they're going to look to their assistants and advisors. And you know what their assistants and advisors are going to do? Some of them, at least, will look to Daniel Faggella and Gennady Stolyarov and some of the other people on here, Daniel Elton and so on, and say, you guys, what do you think? So we need to be ready.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And I wanted to offer a few thoughts with regard to the problems with some young people experiencing depression. This seems to me the result of certain social media sites monopolizing their time and the lack of multifaceted and balanced feedback from other segments of their lives. So many people who are immersed in multiple communities, who have close ties to other people in the physical world, they generally would not experience that extreme response to, say, people bullying them online or having unrealistic image expectations, because they interact with other people who give them feedback that is more accepting of who they actually are. And as long as people are essentially immersed in these communities that provide meaning and support and reassurance, they're not going to be motivated to take these extreme self-destructive behaviors. I think a lot of teenagers are vulnerable to that because they are sometimes not immersed in supportive communities, because the public school system segregates people by age and discourages people from interacting with members of other generations, not as an overt philosophy, but implicitly based on the structure of public schooling. Most of the interactions that teenagers get are with other teenagers, and there the lowest common denominator tends to prevail, whether that be in the school building or within social media. So I think actually getting people intellectually involved in multi-generational kinds of settings where they can get feedback from people who are much older, more experienced, more knowledgeable than they could be the antidote to those kinds of social media pathologies. I also wanted to bring in some comments from Alexandria Black on the question of whether governments should support these kinds of more benign or self-benefiting AI systems. Alexandria writes, if these systems are government funded, how can we be sure that they would not decrease our agency? And she also points out, how do we make sure that regulators have any proficiency in the field? Because very often we see with technology, regulations and laws that are enacted, statutes that are enacted, often are reactionary by many years. And this is because of a lack of awareness among politicians and regulators as to the state of the art of the technology. So they may be responding to something either that was the paradigm 10 years ago, or something that stirred a lot of sensations. So there might be a news media story, say, about a 14-year-old who committed suicide because of social media, and people are rightly outraged, and they say, well, we need to do something about it. But they haven't been keeping up with the advancements in the field. So they may be thinking of a very different ecosystem from the one that actually exists today and what young people are actually doing today. And to some extent, we're all vulnerable to that unless we ourselves are immersed in those kinds of worlds. So what are your thoughts, both Daniel and David, since you brought up the possibility of government somehow contributing to beneficent AI? How do we also make sure that those kinds of developments don't fall prey to the common vulnerabilities of government intervention and government ignorance in technological fields?
Yeah, I suspect David might have more nuance on actual governance than I, but I'll just, I do think that, the idea that they'd have very much proficiency, I think is going to be a toughie. To David's point, maybe they're going to start Googling things and they're going to find folks, who might have informed perspectives on these topics, scientists, policy thinkers, whatever the case may be. But I think for the time being, the public sector is astronomically behind the private sector, which is pretty doggone slow in terms of sort of what is AI capable of, how might we wield it in any kind of a productive sense. So I don't have a lot of faith there. I do think that if there's a lot of great dialogue and the dialogue is open to a lot of folks that are smart in the field, that's probably about as good as we've got. I do think the incentives are pretty tough, and I don't have any great ways of getting around it. I think the incentives ultimately are getting reelected. And so I think it's really about what is your constituency, what would your constituency care about? And then I think things would get down to Labor Party, Conservative Party, whatever the parties are over in Britain these days, the Whigs and the Tories or something. I don't remember. I think that there would come a point where if I'm gonna start talking about this behind a podium, I better be doing it in a way that's gonna get my people frothing at the mouth and putting their tickets in. And so, China's got a different ballgame here, and I don't admire their governance, but I think they have the advantage of thinking a little bit more long term. So I feel pessimistic about that, and I think the risk that I'll just put on the table to be mindful of on at least some level is also being able to maintain at least a decent amount of technological predominance. I think if we really pump the brakes on this stuff super hardcore and China doesn't, I think that's a tough scenario. And so I do think that we've got to balance what are going to really further the rights and hopefully further the well-being of our own citizenry, but hopefully bear in mind that gets couched inside of a global ecosystem where the values that we value aren't actually in the air. They're only breathable because we're strong enough to uphold them. And so my wariness is that Europe in general isn't bearing a tremendous amount of that in mind. I'm sure America has all of its own flaws. I'm not calling America the right in terms of its policy perspectives, but I do think that thinking a lot about this might get us in a spot where, government wants to have checkpoints on every development of AI, and I think China would like that very much.
There are indeed lots of issues with regulators not doing jobs very well. Part of it is that sometimes they're not very well skilled in the subject, or their knowledge is out of date. They may have learned a bit about AI 10 years ago, and that's almost useless nowadays because so much has changed in the last 10 years. So that's one problem. Another problem is that some of the people offering advice on regulation or ethics, they have what I would say very narrow ethics. They're only concerned to avoid risk rather than highlighting the wonderful possibilities that are ahead. So they practice only the precautionary principle without paying enough attention to the proactionary principle. I think we need both, by the way. I'm not opposed to the precautionary principle, which says if you interpret it properly, not in some bastardized version of it, but properly it says if there's a risk of something going terribly wrong, you need to be able to figure out in advance how you might back out of it if it does go terribly wrong. But too much of what I've seen in some AI ethics frameworks is, well, we can't do anything unless we're sure it's absolutely fair. We can't do anything unless we're sure we got completely unbiased data. That's not real world stuff, and that's unhelpful and unhealthy. The third problem with regulations and politicians is they often get stuck into ruts. There are many people who advocate a political statement, not because they believe it, but because it's sort of what their party is signed up to and what they think they're signed up to. It's absolutely awful. So the most interesting stuff about these all-party parliamentary groups and mixing with MPs is that when you see them in the House of Commons, and I'm sure it's the same in the US Congress, they seem awful. They're fighting each other, calling each other child yahoo and cheering and booing. When you get them separately, actually, some of them are quite intelligent people. Some of them actually went into politics to make a better world. A lot of them went into politics to make a better world, but then they get stuck into terrible systems. So there are many obstacles there. However, people are aware and people are trying to fix it. Many ex-politicians are trying to fix it. One of the most interesting groups in Britain is the group set up by a former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. You know, he was Prime Minister who won 3 elections. He's still quite a young man, and he has set up an organization. I've spoken to 3 of the members recently. They are academics. They are people who have worked in numerous parts of industry and in government in the past, and they are all coming up with advice on the regulation of AI. So I wasn't joking before when I said the MPs don't know the answers, but they look to advisors for answers, and some of the advisors are actually making some progress. So we need to have these discussions, and it's not going to be easy, but then any technical thing is not easy. You know, you don't learn calculus overnight. You don't learn the laws of organic chemistry overnight. You don't learn how to build an AI system overnight. There's huge amounts of learning. It's the same with the regulations. It's going to take some time to make sure we get things that motivate the right kind of behavior and flag up early areas of profound risk. I don't care about the small risks that you can easily recover from. That's fine, but the areas of profound risk. So we need to improve our game. We need to pay people more. So Tony Blair and his funders are paying a whole bunch of people to investigate this, but I think government should be doing more too, and to give them their credits. Many governments around the world are cooperating. There's something called GPAI, the Global Partnership on AI, not to be confused with PAI, the Partnership on AI, just to make matters complicated. There are 2 separate organizations. GPAI has got more government liaison around the world, and gradually they are making some progress. Not as fast as I would like, but they are waking up. And with all the pressures now from ChatGPT and DALI and Midjourney, their constituents are ringing them up. The reasons why these MPs I mentioned had gone to Tim Clement Jones of the all-party parliamentary group was they had been receiving letters, they had had meetings with their constituents in their surgeries who said, what's going to happen to my job? Am I going to be put out of job by this? Should we be regulating it? And so people are speaking up, and it's causing people to look around. So we've got to help in our own way with what we understand from a transhumanist perspective, that this isn't just closing down possibilities. This is identifying the really wonderful possibilities. As Dan was speaking about, these AIs could augment us and help us to take the best decisions, help us to have wonderful experiences in Netflix plus plus or Netflix 2030 or whatever, but then also come back to the real world and have wonderful, effective relationships here too.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you, David, for those remarks. And in the 2 minutes that we have remaining, I would like to offer Dan the opportunity to make some closing comments. If you could relate them to how we could realize the most wonderful possible paths of the development of AI and other emerging technologies, I think this would be a great way to close.
Yeah, wow. Well, I appreciate David chipping in there. Insightful as always. Going to be tough to put a nutshell in this far-reaching conversation here today. I'm glad to get some multiple perspectives. I think ultimately a commonality, if I'm going to pick on one thread that maybe we can take home, it does seem as though we're all more or less on the same page that there could be a very strong vacuum pull towards lotus eating, and that there is a combination of cultural and technological innovation required to ensure that we maintain being contributors, which may not mean working on the physical compute in the physical world, but at least staying in touch with an objective physical reality and a shared subjective reality, as opposed to being zipped off into the land of pleasure, which I think most of us would agree is a pretty non-safe place to be, a pretty dangerous place to be. So I think if we can further the cultural push in that direction, and if we can build technologies consciously bearing agency in our productive capacity in mind, knowing how much we're going to have to fight eating the lotus, hopefully that'll build a better future. And hopefully that's a good wrap up for the conversation, Gennady. Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Dan, for joining us, as well as David Wood for your insightful comments, and to our U.S. Transhumanist Party officers and to our viewers on YouTube. We've had excellent engagement as always, and indeed, I would encourage everyone to think about ways in which we can harness these emerging technologies to empower ourselves as individuals, to improve our societies, to bring out what Steven Pinker called the better angels of our nature, all the while we maintain connection to the objective reality. And we use venues, including virtual venues like this one, in order to motivate thinking about how our world can be dramatically improved to realize those wonderful possibilities that David Wood was describing. So thank you to everyone, and please tune in every Sunday at 1 p.m. U.S. Pacific Time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and I hope you all live long and prosper.